Drew Brees could play 5 or 6 more years and be great, but at any time, it could just sort of not be there anymore.
Right.
We're talking about the New Orleans Saints.
Yes.
They were 13-3 last year.
That's good.
I don't know if you heard, but they came extremely close to going to the Super Bowl. There was one particular play that a lot of people thought might have swung it against them. So do you think, I mean, it's a crazy question. Obviously, do you think they'll be worse or better? There's almost no way to be better. There's only a couple of games above 13.
Hey, I mean, you know what? They're a pretty good team, though.
Yeah.
Stranger things have happened than the Saints getting better than 13-3. But you look at history, look at even great teams like last year's Saints, they typically tend to decline the following year. And there are a few reasons why with the numbers, with some of their personnel moves, even possibly their quarterback. Might make you think they're not going to be quite as good. Still good, but not quite as good as that 13-3 mark from a year ago.
So the point differential, turnover differential, and what kind of things work in the favor of, I mean, look, we're not sitting here saying the Saints aren't going to be any good this year.
Right, that's the thing.
13 is a huge number.
Yes.
So if it were to drop to 12 or 11 to 10, what would be the reason?
You start with the one-score games. Saints were 5-1 in the one-score games. And you figure, hey, Sean Payton, Drew Brees, pretty good start, right?
Sure.
Like you figure they win a lot of close games. They were 36-35 in those games with Sean Payton and Drew Brees before last season. So historically, that has not been something they've been able to pull off, something that really teams on the whole have not been able to pull off year after year in the NFL. So you'd figure they might be 4-2, might be 3-3, might be 2-4 in those games. Who knows next year? But that could be the biggest reason why they're not going to be quite as good, just because you can't win 80% or 90% of your close games year after year.
Then I think we got to look at what they did in the offseason, right, to try and improve. And I know there were some wide receivers they went after, didn't get. They end up with Jared Cook, the tight end, who had a big year for Oakland last year. Maybe he's a dynamic threat. But they needed something besides Alvin Kamara and Michael Thomas, because I mean, just watching them and talking to people around the league the second half of last year, there was a sense that maybe that offense got a little bit, I don't want to say stale, but not as enthralling as it was early in the season.
Right.
Maybe so I think Sean Payton's mission is to try and expand things a little bit. Maybe Cook helps with that. They lose Mark Ingram. They're going to have to replace him.
Yep.
So I look at what they did this offseason and wonder if did they improve? Or did they get a little worse on paper?
Yeah.
I think it's worth asking that question.
There's definitely talent there, and I like some of the moves they made, but look at the biggest player on that roster, at least not in size, but in stature, it's Drew Brees. And I think the concern is, you mentioned that second half drop-off. Some of that was the offense, probably as a whole, but was any of that Drew Brees?
I mean, he's not 25.
He's not 25.
Yeah.
And he was an MVP candidate through November. December, and in the playoffs, he was a guy. And Drew Brees, for his entire career, has not been, since maybe the first couple of years in San Diego, he was not just a guy. He was the guy and has been the guy for a long time. So even in that playoff game against the Rams, he was not the same player he had been earlier in the season. I think that's my concern, is just, we know old quarterbacks fall off a cliff. Peyton Manning a few years ago is a good example of what can happen there. And even if this is a great team around him, and the Broncos did win a Super Bowl with that version of Peyton Manning, Drew Brees might not be the same guy we've seen in years past in 2019.
Yeah, that Broncos team is an example of sort of a team that dragged the quarterback to the finish line as opposed to vice versa. So, but you're right. I mean, Peyton Manning was setting league records a year or two before that, and all of a sudden
he
off
was
the cliff.
benched for Brock Osweiler.
Drew Brees could play 5 or 6 more years and be great, but at any time it could just sort of not be there anymore.
Right.
I mean, that's why the Saints are trying to put this thing together, and now they know that that's a short window they're working with.
Right, and on top of that, you think about the division they played in a year ago. Atlanta was a mess all year because of injuries. Carolina looked great for the first half, and then Cam's shoulder got hurt. They were beat up all year on the offensive line. The Saints were one of the healthiest teams in football. I think 6th by Football Outsiders stats when it comes to health a year ago. So they were one of the healthiest teams. In a division where you had the two competitors against you really banged up and beat up all year, you'd figure that's not going to be the case again in 2019, and this is going to be a tough division for the Saints to dominate. They're going to still be in the running, I think, but the idea that they're going to win the division by several games, I find that hard to believe.
So it makes sense to think that they'll slip back from 13 just because 13 is such a huge number.
Of course.
But what if they didn't? What would be the reason that the Saints turned out to be even better than they were last year?
Well, you start with Drew Brees, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if Drew Brees is the guy we've seen in years past, this is maybe the best offense in football. It's a defense that they really struggled early in the season last year. They had that 40-point game against Ryan Fitzpatrick and the Bucs. They improved. They traded for Eli Apple. That kind of solidified a cornerback spot. From that point forward, the defense was great. So you combine the offense with Drew Brees from the first half, the defense with Eli Apple and company from the second half. That's the best team in football to me.
Yeah.
So if the Falcons aren't as good as we expect, if the Panthers aren't as good as we expect, this could be a division where the Saints do walk over again. I just don't think it's likely, but it is possible.
I agree they're loaded, but man, they got to replace a center in Max Unger, who retired. Mark Ingram was an important piece for them. Sure. They have to figure out the run game around Kamara. So some things for the Saints to work on if they want to be 13-3 or even better again this year. Keep watching to find out which other teams we think might take steps forward or backward in 2019. And for more premium content and live streaming, you can subscribe to ESPN Plus.